December 17, 1944. Iwil, Belgium. A United States military police checkpoint materialized through the morning fog like a specter from a nightmare. The engine of an approaching jeep idled too smoothly, its occupants too composed for men who had just driven through the chaos of the German offensive that had erupted the previous day. The sentry raised his hand. 3 soldiers in American uniforms sat in the vehicle, their gear regulation perfect, their expressions betraying nothing. "Password," the sentry demanded. The driver hesitated, just a fraction of a second, but in that fraction, everything changed. Within minutes, Unteroffizier Manfred Pernas, Oberfähnrich Günther Billing, and Gefreiter Wilhelm Schmidt stood with their hands raised, their perfect American uniforms suddenly rendered meaningless by words they could not speak. Their identification papers read Charles W. Lawrence, Clarence van der Wert, and George Sensenbach, but the names were fiction, the uniforms were stolen, and the mission they had undertaken would trigger one of the most extraordinary security panics in American military history. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Operation Greif represented Adolf Hitler's last desperate gamble to exploit a fundamental vulnerability in modern warfare. In the fog of battle, amid the confusion of massed armies moving through foreign territory, how could soldiers distinguish friend from foe? The answer had always relied on uniforms, insignia, and military bearing. But what happened when the enemy deliberately violated those markers? What happened when German commandos spoke fluent English, wore captured American uniforms, and drove stolen American vehicles deep behind Allied lines? The answer would reveal something profound about identity, culture, and the subtle markers that separate one people from another. The Germans had studied American speech patterns, memorized American slang, and practiced American mannerisms, but they had not accounted for baseball. To understand Operation Greif, we must first understand the man who conceived it and the desperate strategic situation that made such an audacious plan necessary. By October 1944, Nazi Germany faced annihilation from 2 directions. Soviet forces pressed from the east, having liberated their homeland and pushed into Poland. American and British armies advanced from the west, having broken out of Normandy and liberated Paris. The Third Reich, which Hitler had promised would last 1,000 years, was entering its final winter after barely 12. Hitler's response was characteristically bold and characteristically delusional. Rather than consolidate defenses or negotiate surrender, he would launch one final massive offensive. The target was the Ardennes forest, the same terrain through which German forces had driven in 1940, catching French and British armies by surprise. Hitler believed he could repeat that success, driving a wedge between American and British forces, capturing the vital port of Antwerp, and forcing the Western Allies to negotiate a separate peace. The offensive required speed above all else. German forces would have to capture bridges over the Meuse River intact before American engineers could destroy them. Any delay would give the Allies time to recover from their surprise and mass forces to block the German advance. For this critical task, Hitler turned to SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, already legendary for his unconventional operations. Otto Skorzeny was born in Vienna in 1980. He studied engineering and earned a reputation in student dueling societies that left him with a distinctive scar on his left cheek. He joined the Nazi Party in 1931 and the SS in 1933. By 1943, he commanded the SS, Special Operations Unit Friedenthal, specializing in commando raids and unconventional warfare. Skorzeny first gained international notoriety in September 1943 when he led a daring glider assault on the Gran Sasso mountain resort in Italy, rescuing Benito Mussolini from captivity after the Italian government had overthrown him. The operation succeeded brilliantly, and Mussolini was spirited away in a light aircraft from a mountaintop airstrip. Hitler personally decorated Skorzeny with the Knight's Cross. In October 1944, Skorzeny supervised the kidnapping of Miklos Horthy Jr., son of Hungary's regent, to force the elder Horthy's resignation and prevent Hungary from abandoning the Axis alliance. The operation succeeded, keeping Hungary in the war and ensuring continued Hungarian Jewish deportations to Auschwitz. By this point, Skorzeny had become one of Hitler's most trusted special operations commanders, the man called upon when conventional military action proved insufficient. On October 22, 1944, Hitler summoned Skorzeny to his headquarters at Rastenburg in East Prussia. After congratulating him on the Hungarian operation, Hitler outlined the planned Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny's role would be critical. He would form a special brigade, Panzer Brigade 150, whose mission was to capture at least one bridge over the Meuse River before American forces could destroy it. Then Hitler added the element that would make Operation Greif legendary and legally dubious. Hitler informed Skorzeny that this could be accomplished more quickly and with fewer losses if Skorzeny and his men wore American uniforms. Small units, disguised in enemy uniforms, could cause enormous confusion among American forces by giving false orders, disrupting communications, and misdirecting troops. Skorzeny was well aware of the implications. Under the Hague Convention of 1907, soldiers captured while wearing enemy uniforms forfeited their rights as prisoners of war and could be executed as spies. This caused significant discussion with Generaloberst Jodl and Field Marshal von Rundstedt. German legal experts advised that as long as Skorzeny's men removed their American uniforms before engaging in actual combat, the tactic remained a legitimate ruse of war. The distinction was thin. Infiltration and deception while wearing enemy uniforms was permissible. Fighting while wearing those uniforms was not. The timing gave Skorzeny only 5 or 6 weeks to recruit and train an entirely new unit. Within 4 days, he submitted plans for Panzer Brigade 150 to Jodl. Despite requesting 3,300 men, he received immediate approval and promises of full support. The Wehrmacht issued an order on October 25th, requesting suitable soldiers with knowledge of English language and American dialect. The request went to every headquarters on the Western Front. This was Skorzeny's first critical mistake. The order, headed secret commando operations and signed by Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel himself, could not possibly remain secret. Within days, Allied intelligence intercepted information about German recruitment of English speakers for special operations. The responses to Skorzeny's recruitment call revealed the gulf between ambition and reality. He had requested soldiers fluent in American English, familiar with American slang and customs. What arrived at the training camp at Grafenwöhr in eastern Bavaria was something quite different. Skorzeny ultimately assembled approximately 2,500 men, but only 10 spoke perfect English and possessed knowledge of American idioms. Another 30 to 40 spoke English well, but lacked understanding of slang. Between 120 and 150 spoke English moderately well. The majority spoke little to no English whatsoever. 21-year-old Gefreiter Fritz Christ typified many volunteers. When he saw the recruitment notice, he thought it meant interpreting Allied prisoners of war, allowing him to avoid frontline combat. Instead, he found himself training for one of the war's most dangerous missions. The equipment situation proved equally problematic. Skorzeny requested 15 tanks, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, 100 jeeps, 40 motorcycles, 120 trucks, and sufficient British and American uniforms to outfit his force. What arrived fell woefully short. Instead of 15 Sherman tanks, he received 2, both in poor condition with one breaking down almost immediately. Units throughout the German military, confused about the purpose of the request, sent whatever Allied equipment they possessed. Polish and Russian equipment arrived in quantity, useless for impersonating American troops. Uniforms came in various conditions. Many were British rather than American. Some bore bloodstains. Others had prisoner of war markings. Summer-weight uniforms arrived for an operation planned for December in Belgium. Faced with these limitations, Skorzeny divided his force into 2 distinct elements. The first, Einheit Stylau, comprised the best English speakers organized into jeep and truck teams. They received the highest quality Allied equipment and weaponry available. Their mission was pure infiltration, penetrate American lines, spread confusion, disrupt supply convoys, modify or destroy road signs, cut telephone cables, and report enemy troop movements via radio. The second element, the bulk of Panzer Brigade 150, would operate as a conventional armored unit. German Panther tanks were disguised with additional armor plates to vaguely resemble American Sherman tanks, though Skorzeny admitted that only very young American troops, seeing them from very far away at night, would be fooled. Training emphasized American mannerisms and speech patterns. The commandos watched American films to study accents and gestures. They practiced American marching styles, which differed from German goose-stepping. They learned to smoke cigarettes the American way, to chew gum casually, to gesture more expansively than German military culture permitted. Some commandos interviewed American prisoners of war, ostensibly for intelligence purposes, but actually to absorb authentic American speech patterns and cultural knowledge. The interactions were carefully supervised. German guards ensured prisoners did not realize they were serving as unwitting teachers for infiltration operations. The commandos studied American military organization, rank insignia, and unit identification. They memorized the structure of American divisions, the names of American commanders, and the typical equipment of American units. They learned how American soldiers wore their uniforms, which items were regulated, and which personal preferences were common. But there were limits to what could be taught. American culture, particularly in 1944, was shaped by elements difficult for foreigners to fully absorb. One element stood paramount: baseball. Baseball in 1944 occupied a cultural position in America that no sport possessed in Germany. It was not merely entertainment. It was a shared language, a common reference point that transcended regional, ethnic, and economic differences. Every American boy, regardless of background, knew the difference between the American and National Leagues. Every American could name the reigning World Series champions. Baseball statistics, team standings, and player reputations formed part of the basic cultural literacy of being American. German culture had no equivalent. Football, as Americans knew it, barely existed in Germany. German sports culture revolved around soccer, which Americans called football confusingly. Track and field athletics held importance, but no German sport penetrated daily conversation the way baseball saturated American discourse. This cultural gap would prove fatal to Operation Greif's Infiltrators. The German offensive launched at 5:30 a.m. on December 16, 1944. Over 250,000 German troops poured through the Ardennes forest, hitting American lines held by just 83,000 troops. The initial American divisions facing the assault, the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions, were either inexperienced or exhausted from earlier fighting. The Germans achieved complete tactical surprise. Einheitsstierlau infiltrated during the offensive's opening hours. Teams of 3 to 4 men in American jeeps drove through gaps in American lines created by the German assault. They carried authentic American weapons, authentic American maps, and forged American identification papers. Their orders were explicit: do not engage in combat while wearing American uniforms. Gather intelligence, spread confusion, and return. Some teams achieved remarkable success. One group entered the town of Malmedy on December 16th and scouted American defenses before withdrawing. Another team convinced an American convoy to turn onto a different road, delaying its arrival at a critical junction. Several teams cut telephone lines connecting American command posts. One team severed a cable linking General Courtney Hodges's 1st Army headquarters with Corps headquarters, temporarily disrupting command and control. But the capture of Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt near Eiweil on December 17th changed everything. They failed to provide the correct password when challenged at the checkpoint. Subsequent searches revealed they carried 2 Sten machine pistols, British weapons rarely seen in American hands. They possessed $900 and £1,000 in cash, far more than American enlisted men would carry. Most damning, beneath their American fatigues they wore German field grey uniforms. Under interrogation, the 3 men confirmed they were part of a large special operation. Then 24-year-old Wilhelm Schmidt, perhaps deliberately, perhaps under stress, added a detail that would send American security into absolute paranoia. He claimed their operation included a mission to capture or kill General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander. Whether Schmidt invented this claim to create maximum confusion or whether he genuinely believed it remains unclear. No evidence suggests Operation Greif ever targeted Eisenhower personally. But Schmidt's claim fit perfectly with Skorzény's reputation. This was the man who had rescued Mussolini from captivity and kidnapped the son of Hungary's regent. If anyone could infiltrate Paris and attack Eisenhower in his own headquarters, it was Otto Skorzeny. American intelligence had already captured documents outlining Operation Greif's deception elements, though not its actual objectives, from the 106th Infantry Division near Heckenscheid on December 16th. Combined with Skorzeny's fearsome reputation and Schmidt's claim about Eisenhower, Allied High Command believed they faced a massive infiltration operation with hundreds, perhaps thousands, of German commandos operating behind American lines. The response was immediate and comprehensive. Security around Eisenhower tightened dramatically. He was confined to his headquarters at Versailles, surrounded by heavy guard details. He spent Christmas 1944 essentially under house arrest, unable to move freely. After several days of confinement, Eisenhower reportedly left his office angrily, declaring he had to get out and did not care if anyone tried to kill him. But the broader American response had far more significant effects on military operations. Checkpoints appeared throughout the American rear area, dramatically slowing movement of soldiers and equipment. Military police at these checkpoints began interrogating passing troops using questions designed to expose German infiltrators. The questions focused on elements of American culture that Germans would struggle to answer correctly: state capitals, sports scores, popular culture trivia, the names of movie stars' spouses, Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name, but most frequently, baseball. Who plays center field for the Yankees? What team won the last World Series? Are the Chicago Cubs in the American League or National League? Which teams play in the American League versus the National League? Who holds the record for home runs in a single season? For American soldiers, these questions posed no difficulty. Baseball knowledge was absorbed unconsciously through childhood. Through summer afternoons playing sandlot games, through fathers and sons listening to radio broadcasts, through newspaper sports sections read over breakfast. An American soldier might not consciously study baseball, but he knew it nonetheless. For German infiltrators, even those who had studied American culture intensively, the questions were impossible. Baseball simply did not exist in their cultural background. They might memorize that the New York Yankees played in the American League, or that the St. Louis Cardinals had won the 1944 World Series. But under pressure, at a checkpoint with rifles pointed at them, that memorized information often failed to surface correctly. The checkpoint interrogations produced both successes and absurd failures. Several actual German infiltrators were captured when they could not answer baseball questions correctly. But the paranoid atmosphere also generated numerous false positives, detaining genuine American soldiers who happened to lack sports knowledge or who gave technically correct answers that seemed wrong to poorly informed questioners. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, found himself repeatedly stopped at checkpoints and questioned. On one occasion, he correctly identified Springfield as the capital of Illinois. The military police officer who questioned him insisted the capital was Chicago and nearly detained Bradley as a suspected German infiltrator. Bradley reportedly had to prove his identity by naming Betty Grable's current husband, Hollywood bandleader Harry James. Brigadier General Bruce C. Clark was detained at gunpoint for an extended period after he incorrectly identified the Chicago Cubs as an American League team. The Cubs played in the National League, a fact any genuine American baseball fan would know instantly. Clark, despite being a genuine American general, simply did not follow baseball closely. His detention lasted until higher-ranking officers vouched for his identity. A captain spent a week in detention after guards noticed he wore German boots. He was an authentic American officer who had simply acquired better footwear from German prisoners after his own boots wore out. But in the paranoid atmosphere following Operation Greif, wearing any item of German origin made soldiers suspect. The checkpoint system created enormous friction in American operations. Commanders found themselves delayed at roadblocks, forced to answer trivial questions while urgent orders needed delivery. Supply convoys sat immobilized at checkpoints while drivers proved their identity. Reinforcements moved slowly as each checkpoint verified every soldier's American credentials. On December 20th, 2 American soldiers were killed by a nervous military police officer at a checkpoint, victims of the paranoia Operation Greif had created. They were genuine American troops, but something about their responses to questions triggered suspicion, and the guard fired before the misunderstanding could be resolved. The security measures also created international tension. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's Jeep had its tires shot out by overzealous American soldiers, convinced they had discovered German infiltrators. Montgomery, whose relations with American commanders were already strained, was reportedly less than amused. Yet despite the chaos, the checkpoint system worked. German infiltrators found movement increasingly difficult. Several teams were captured when they could not answer American cultural questions. Others were detected through subtle markers, pronunciation errors, unfamiliarity with American military procedures, or simply suspicious behavior. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The trial of Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt established the legal framework for handling captured infiltrators. They were tried by military commission at Henry Chapelle, Belgium, on December 21, 1944. The charges cited violation of Article 23 of the Hague Convention concerning land warfare, which specifically forbade improper use of enemy military insignia and uniforms. The proceedings were swift. Colonel E. M. Brannan of the Staff Judge Advocate reviewed the proceedings the next day, upholding the court-martial findings. Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, commanding 1st Army, approved and confirmed the death sentences that afternoon. The executions were carried out on the morning of December 23rd. The 3 Germans were taken to the execution site behind the American barracks at Henry Chapelle. Military police from the 509th MP Battalion conducted the proceedings. The condemned men were tied to wooden stakes. Large white paper targets were pinned over their hearts. They were blindfolded. A firing squad of 24 soldiers took position. According to witnesses, Pernas and Schmidt faced death in silence. Günther Billing, 21 years old, invoked Hitler's name before the command to fire was given. The volleys rang out. An officer checked to ensure all 3 were dead. Their bodies slumped against the stakes, held upright by the ropes binding them. After they were officially pronounced dead, military police cut them down, carried the bodies away, and buried them. They would eventually be reinterred in the German military cemetery at Lommel, Belgium, along with 39,000 other German soldiers who died fighting in the West. 3 more German infiltrators were tried on December 23rd and executed at Henry Chapelle on December 26th. 7 more were tried on December 26th and executed on December 30th. 3 others were tried on December 31st, 1944, and executed at Huy, Belgium, on January 13th, 1945. In total, at least 18 German commandos from Operation Greif were captured behind American lines. 16 were executed after military trials. The executions were authorized by Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, pursuant to authority delegated by General Omar Bradley, commanding general of the 12th Army Group, on instructions from General Dwight Eisenhower, commanding the European Theater of Operations. The executions generated some controversy, both during and after the war. Critics argued the Germans had followed Skorzény's orders to remove American uniforms before engaging in combat, technically making their actions legitimate ruses of war rather than violations of the Hague Convention. But military courts drew a clear distinction. The infiltrators had been captured while wearing enemy uniforms. That alone violated the laws of war, regardless of whether they had engaged in actual combat. The legal precedent would become important at Skorzény's own war crimes trial. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Skorzeny surrendered to the 30th Infantry Regiment. He spent 2 years in prison, awaiting trial at the Dachau Military Tribunal in 1947. Skorzeny and 9 officers of Panzer Brigade 150 were charged with improperly using American uniforms by entering into combat disguised therewith and treacherously firing upon and killing members of the United States Armed Forces. They were also charged with participation in wrongfully obtaining American uniforms and Red Cross parcels from prisoner of war camps. The trial produced a surprise defense. F.F.E. Joe Thomas, a former Allied Special Operations executive agent, testified that he and his operatives had worn German uniforms behind enemy lines during covert operations. This established that both sides had employed similar deception tactics. More importantly, the prosecution could not prove that Skorzeny had actually ordered his men to fight while wearing American uniforms. The military tribunal drew a critical distinction between using enemy uniforms during combat and using them for other purposes, including deception and infiltration. As long as soldiers removed enemy uniforms before engaging in combat, such tactics constituted legitimate ruses of war under international law. The tribunal acquitted all defendants. Skorzeny's men, who had been captured and executed, had died legally under military law as it existed in December 1944. But Skorzeny himself, who had planned and commanded the operation, could not be convicted of war crimes for an operation that fell within the bounds of legitimate military deception. The practical impact of Operation Greif bore little resemblance to its ambitious objectives. The operation never achieved its primary goal of capturing Meuse River bridges. German armored spearheads never penetrated far enough west to create opportunities for Panzer Brigade 150 to exploit. The infiltration teams accomplished some tactical successes, cutting communications, misdirecting convoys, and gathering intelligence. But these achievements were minor compared to the operation's intended scope. Yet Operation Greif succeeded brilliantly at an unintended objective, creating psychological chaos far exceeding its actual threat. With perhaps 40 German soldiers successfully infiltrating American lines, Operation Greif convinced American commanders they faced hundreds of disguised infiltrators. The security measures implemented to counter this perceived threat disrupted American operations far more effectively than the actual German infiltrators ever could have. The checkpoint system, the constant interrogations, the delays in moving troops and supplies, the diversion of military police to security duties, and the overall atmosphere of paranoia all served German interests. For several critical days during the Battle of the Bulge's opening phase, American forces moved slowly and responded hesitantly, partly due to the confusion Operation Greif created. The psychological impact extended to the highest levels. Eisenhower's confinement to quarters removed him from direct battlefield oversight at a crucial moment. Bradley's command authority was temporarily undermined when Eisenhower transferred 1st and 9th Armies to British Field Marshal Montgomery's command on December 20th, a decision driven partly by the disrupted communications and command confusion in Bradley's sector. The battle itself lasted from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945. German forces initially drove deep into American lines, creating the Bulge in Allied positions that gave the battle its name. But the offensive ultimately failed. American forces at Bastogne held out against encirclement, denying Germans a crucial road junction. Patton's Third Army wheeled north to relieve Bastogne by December 26th. Weather cleared, allowing Allied air power to devastate German supply columns. By January, the German offensive had exhausted itself. American counterattacks pushed German forces back to their starting positions. The Battle of the Bulge cost the Americans approximately 89,000 casualties, including 19,000 killed. German casualties exceeded 100,000, with losses the Wehrmacht could not replace. Operation Greif's legacy extended beyond the immediate battle. The use of baseball questions and cultural shibboleths to identify infiltrators became standard practice in subsequent operations. The principle was sound: exploit cultural knowledge that enemies could not easily acquire, regardless of language fluency. Similar techniques appeared in other theaters and conflicts. During the Pacific War, American forces used pronunciation tests, exploiting phonetic differences between Japanese and English. In Vietnam, American troops developed their own cultural shibboleths to identify Viet Cong infiltrators. The concept of using deep cultural knowledge as a security measure became a recognized counter-infiltration tactic. The ethical dimensions of the checkpoint interrogations merit examination. Unlike some security measures, the cultural questioning caused no physical harm. Soldiers who passed the tests suffered no consequences beyond brief delay. Those who failed were detained for additional verification, not automatically executed. The measure was essentially diagnostic, identifying linguistic and cultural background through objective evidence. The baseball questions also highlighted an important principle about identity. The test measured cultural knowledge acquired through childhood immersion in American society. Japanese Americans serving in the Pacific, Polish Americans in Europe, and soldiers of every ethnic background passed the tests automatically because their cultural identity was genuinely American, regardless of their ancestry. Conversely, German infiltrators failed not because of their ethnicity, but because they lacked authentic American cultural formation. A German who had spent childhood in America would have passed the baseball tests easily. The measure distinguished genuine Americans from those merely pretending to be American, making it fundamentally different from ethnic discrimination. The broader implications of Operation Greif extended into the post-war understanding of unconventional warfare and the laws of armed conflict. The Skorzeny trial established important legal precedents about the use of enemy uniforms in military operations. The tribunal's distinction between wearing enemy uniforms for infiltration versus wearing them during actual combat created a framework that remains relevant in modern military law. The ruling essentially permitted deception operations using enemy uniforms as long as combatants removed those uniforms before engaging in hostile acts. This allowed for reconnaissance, sabotage preparation, and intelligence gathering while maintaining legal protections under the Geneva Conventions. The precedent influenced subsequent military doctrine on special operations and covert action. Skorzeny himself escaped from an internment camp in 1948, hiding on a Bavarian farm for 18 months before spending time in Paris and Salzburg. He eventually settled in Spain, where he lived openly under his own name. He served as a military advisor to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser in 1953 and allegedly advised Argentine President Juan Perón. He died in Madrid on July 5, 1975, at age 67, never having served prison time for his wartime activities. The fate of Operation Greif's participants varied widely. Those captured behind Allied lines while wearing American uniforms faced execution, as the laws of war demanded. Those who removed their uniforms before capture or who never successfully infiltrated Allied lines survived to become prisoners of war entitled to Geneva Convention protections. Those who remained with Panzer Brigade 150 in its conventional combat role fought and died as regular soldiers. The psychological legacy of Operation Greif persisted long after the battle ended. For months afterward, American troops remained suspicious of anyone whose behavior seemed unusual. Checkpoint interrogations continued, though with less intensity. The cultural questions became institutionalized in military police training as a legitimate security procedure. Veterans of the Battle of the Bulge remembered the paranoid atmosphere vividly. In memoirs written decades later, soldiers described the surreal experience of being questioned by their own countrymen, of having to prove their American identity through knowledge of baseball statistics and movie star gossip. Some found the experience humiliating. Others understood its necessity. All recognized how effectively Operation Greif had exploited the fog of war. The role of baseball in American military culture during World War II extended beyond security measures. Baseball provided continuity with home, a link to peacetime normalcy amid the chaos of war. Military units organized baseball teams whenever circumstances permitted. Makeshift diamonds appeared at bases throughout Europe and the Pacific. Soldiers listened to armed forces radio broadcasts of major league games, hungry for any connection to the America they were fighting to preserve. Many professional baseball players served in the military during the war. Ted Williams, Joe DiMaggio, Bob Feller, and Warren Spahn all interrupted stellar careers to serve. Spahn, who would become a Hall of Fame pitcher, fought at the Battle of the Bulge with the combat engineers. He later said he thought he knew cold growing up in Buffalo, but he did not really know cold until the Bulge. The weather during the battle was indeed brutal. Hitler had timed his offensive to coincide with an outbreak of freezing rain, sub-zero temperatures, and dense fog conditions that grounded Allied aircraft and prevented them from attacking German ground forces. American troops, many lacking proper cold weather equipment, suffered enormous casualties from exposure. The First Army alone recorded more than 64,000 cold injuries during the winter of 1944–45, including trench foot, frostbite, and pneumonia. Standard-issue American combat boots were not waterproof. Keeping socks dry became a constant challenge and often proved impossible. The frozen ground made digging foxholes extraordinarily difficult. Soldiers who had fought through the summer heat of Normandy and the autumn mud of the Siegfried Line found the Ardennes winter almost unbearable. Yet despite the cold, the surprise, the initial German success, and the chaos created by Operation Greif, American forces held. The soldiers who manned the checkpoints, who asked the baseball questions, who remained vigilant despite exhaustion and cold. These men prevented Operation Greif from achieving its objectives. Their cultural knowledge, seemingly trivial, became a weapon as effective as any rifle. The checkpoint at Eiweiler, where Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt were captured, no longer exists. The road has been rebuilt and modernized. The Belgian village, which suffered significant damage during the German offensive, was reconstructed in the post-war years. A memorial stands in the town center honoring both American liberators and Belgian civilians killed in the fighting. Henri Chapelle, where the 3 German infiltrators were executed, became the site of an American military cemetery. The Henri Chapelle American Cemetery and Memorial contains 7,992 American war dead, most killed in the Rhineland and Ardennes campaigns. The cemetery sits on 57 acres of rolling Belgian countryside, its white marble crosses and stars of David arranged in precise rows that stretch across manicured lawns. The German military cemetery at Lommel, where Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt were eventually reinterred along with other German war dead, presents a stark contrast. Dark stone markers set low to the ground create a somber atmosphere. 39,000 German soldiers rest there, most killed fighting in Belgium and the Netherlands. The cemetery serves as a reminder that soldiers on both sides were human beings, often young men who believed they were serving their country, regardless of the justice of their cause. The moral complexity of Operation Greif resists simple judgment. The German infiltrators were following orders in a desperate attempt to change their nation's fate. They understood the risks. They knew capture meant execution, yet they volunteered anyway, motivated by loyalty, duty, or perhaps simply the soldiers' acceptance of dangerous missions. The American soldiers who captured, tried, and executed them were also following orders and military law. The Hague Convention explicitly forbade the use of enemy uniforms in the manner Operation Greif employed. The executions, while harsh, were legal under the laws of war as they existed in 1944. The military commissions that tried the captured infiltrators followed proper procedure, provided defense counsel, and allowed appeals through military channels. Skorzény's acquittal at Dachau in 1947 reflected the tribunal's careful legal analysis. The judges distinguished between planning an operation that used enemy uniforms and actually ordering soldiers to fight while wearing those uniforms. Since Skorzeny had explicitly ordered his men to remove American uniforms before engaging in combat, he had technically stayed within the bounds of legitimate military deception. Whether this distinction was morally meaningful remains debatable. Skorzeny knew his men faced execution if captured. He sent them on missions where capture was likely. The fact that he structured orders to provide himself legal protection while exposing his subordinates to death sentences troubled some observers. Yet commanders throughout military history have ordered soldiers into situations where death was probable. Skorzeny's actions, while cynical, were not unprecedented. The checkpoint interrogations themselves raise interesting questions about knowledge and identity. What does it mean to be American? Is American identity defined by citizenship, by birthplace, by cultural knowledge, or by some combination of all three? The baseball questions suggested that authentic American identity required cultural immersion that foreigners could not easily fake. Yet this standard had limitations. Some genuine American soldiers lacked sports knowledge. Intellectuals who preferred literature to baseball, recent immigrants who had not yet absorbed American popular culture, and soldiers from isolated rural areas where baseball was less prominent all struggled with the checkpoint questions. The tests measured a particular kind of American cultural participation, not American identity itself. The cultural emphasis on baseball also reflected class and regional biases embedded in American society. Baseball was predominantly an urban and suburban sport. Rural Americans in some regions followed different sports or none at all. Working-class Americans who spent long hours in factories often lacked time to follow sports. The assumption that every American knew baseball statistics reflected a middle-class, urban perspective that did not capture the full diversity of American experience. Nevertheless, the checkpoint system worked well enough for its intended purpose. It identified most German infiltrators while minimizing false positives. The occasional detention of genuine American officers who could not answer baseball questions was embarrassing but not catastrophic. The system's benefits outweighed its imperfections. The legacy of Operation Greif influenced military thinking about special operations, deception, and psychological warfare. Post-war military theorists studied the operation extensively, analyzing both its tactical execution and its psychological impact. The fact that fewer than 50 infiltrators created panic, affecting hundreds of thousands of troops, demonstrated the potential of psychological operations to amplify limited physical capabilities. Modern special operations doctrine incorporates lessons from Operation Grafe. Military planners understand that deception operations, even when they fail tactically, can succeed psychologically if they create sufficient confusion and fear. The disproportionate response Operation Grafe generated became a case study in how perception can matter more than reality in warfare. The checkpoint interrogation techniques also influenced counterinsurgency doctrine. In asymmetric conflicts where enemy combatants blend with civilian populations, identifying adversaries becomes the primary challenge. Cultural knowledge tests, while imperfect, provide one tool among many for making these distinctions. The principle of using deep cultural knowledge that cannot be easily taught or faked remains relevant in modern counter-infiltration operations. The personal stories of the men involved in Operation Grafe reveal the human dimension of this historical episode. Gunther Billing was 21 years old when he faced the firing squad at Henri Chapelle. Born in April 1923, he came of age during the Nazi period. He joined the Naval Signal Service and somehow acquired enough English to be selected for Einheitsstellung. He died invoking Hitler's name, suggesting he remained committed to National Socialism even facing death. Manfred Pernas was 23, born in August 1920 in Gollnow, Prussia. He served as an Unteroffizier, equivalent to a sergeant, and drove the jeep in which his team traveled. According to military trial records, he remained silent at his execution, facing death without comment. His parents, Willy Hermann Pernas and Charlotte Anna Elisabeth, lost their son to a war that had already consumed millions. Wilhelm Schmidt was 24, the oldest of the three. He had volunteered for the mission, attracted by the prospect of using his linguistic knowledge rather than fighting in frontline combat. His interrogation statement about a plot to capture Eisenhower, whether deliberate misinformation or honest belief, triggered the massive security response that defined Operation Grafe's legacy. He, too, faced death in silence on December 23, 1944. These three men, along with the other captured infiltrators, became casualties of a desperate gamble by a regime in its final months. They were soldiers following orders in a war their nation had started and was now losing. Their mission violated international law. Their executions were legal consequences of those violations. Yet they remain human beings whose lives ended violently far from home, victims of the larger catastrophe of World War II. The American soldiers who served as checkpoint guards, military police, firing squad members, and trial participants also carried the weight of these events. Executing captured soldiers, even legally, troubled many who participated. The firing squad members at Henri Chapelle were not volunteers, but soldiers detailed for an unpleasant duty. They followed orders and conducted the executions professionally, but several later expressed discomfort with the task. The Battle of the Bulge ended in late January 1945 with a decisive American victory. German forces withdrew to their starting positions, having failed to capture any of their objectives. The offensive cost Germany irreplaceable losses in men, tanks, and fuel. The Wehrmacht never recovered offensive capability after the Bulge. The final months of the European war consisted of German retreats and Allied advances. American forces crossed the Rhine River in March 1945. Soviet forces closed on Berlin from the east. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The European war was over. In the Pacific, the war continued until August, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. When Japan surrendered on August 15th, World War II finally ended. The conflict had killed approximately 85 million people worldwide, including about 6 million Jews murdered in the Holocaust. The immediate post-war period brought efforts to establish international legal frameworks, preventing future wars and protecting civilian populations. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted major Nazi war criminals. The Geneva Conventions were revised and expanded to provide clearer rules for armed conflict. The United Nations was founded to provide international mechanisms for resolving disputes without war. Operation Grafe became a footnote in this larger history, a small episode in a massive conflict, yet it illustrated profound truths about warfare, identity, and the cultural markers that define communities. The checkpoint interrogations revealed that belonging to a society involves more than speaking its language or wearing its uniform. Authentic membership requires immersion in shared experiences, accumulated knowledge, and unconscious familiarity with cultural references. Baseball served this purpose in December 1944 because it represented shared American experience across regional and class lines. Nearly every American male had played baseball as a child, listened to games on radio, or followed their local team's progress. The sport created common vocabulary and shared memories that Germans, regardless of language training, could not authentically replicate. The story of Operation Greif reminds us that culture matters. The subtle markers of cultural belonging, the sports we follow, the idioms we use, the references we understand without explanation, define communities more powerfully than formal boundaries or legal definitions. German infiltrators could wear American uniforms and carry American weapons, but they could not wear American cultural knowledge accumulated through childhood. The checkpoint guards who asked about baseball were not conducting sophisticated counterintelligence operations. They were simply asking questions to which every genuine American knew the answers. The simplicity of the approach made it effective. No elaborate interrogation techniques were required, no specialized training, no complex procedures. Just basic cultural knowledge that separated insiders from outsiders. In our contemporary world, these lessons remain relevant. Identity verification increasingly relies on knowledge-based authentication, questions that only the genuine account holder should know. Cultural shibboleths continue to separate community insiders from outsiders, though sometimes with troubling implications for inclusion and belonging. The story also reminds us that war, despite its massive scale and industrial nature, ultimately comes down to individual human decisions. The sentry who challenged the jeep at Iwile on December 17, 1944, made a decision that changed Operation Greif's trajectory. The military police who interrogated Pernas, Billing, and Schmidt gathered information that triggered the massive security response. Individual soldiers at thousands of checkpoints asked questions that identified infiltrators and secured American lines. These were not dramatic battlefield heroics. They were simple professional competence, soldiers doing their jobs with care and attention. Yet their collective efforts defeated an enemy operation designed to create chaos and confusion. They demonstrated that war is won not only by generals making strategic decisions, but by private soldiers executing tactical responsibilities. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The morning of June 10, 1944, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter stood on the cliffs above Arromanches, binoculars pressed against his eyes, watching something that should not exist. Below him, stretching into the English Channel for nearly 8 kilometers, massive concrete structures rose from the water like the bones of some prehistoric creature. British ships were unloading cargo at floating piers that moved up and down with the tide. Trucks drove along roadways that floated on the surface of the ocean. It had been 4 days since the Allied invasion. 4 days after, Richter's 716th Infantry Division had been shattered defending these beaches. He had expected the Allies to attempt capturing Cherbourg, the nearest major port, 50 kilometers to the west. Every German defensive plan had assumed this. Instead, the British were building a port. Here, on an open beach, in less than a week. Richter lowered his binoculars and turned to his operations officer, Major Klaus Hoffmann. "How long did it take us to build the harbor facilities at Cherbourg?" he asked quietly. Hoffmann consulted his notes. "The original port took 7 years to construct, Herr General. Our recent fortifications added another 18 months. Richter looked back at the impossible harbor taking shape below. "They've done this in 4 days, he said. Then, almost to himself, he added the words that would appear in his diary that evening. "The war is over. We just don't know it yet." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment of recognition, repeated in various forms across dozens of German officers during those June days in Normandy, represented something more profound than tactical defeat. It marked the collision between German military doctrine, which emphasized quality, craftsmanship, and battlefield excellence, and American industrial philosophy, which valued speed, scale, and logistical sustainability. The Mulberry harbors were not just engineering marvels. They were visible proof that Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of modern warfare. To understand why the sight of floating harbors shattered German confidence, we must first understand what German officers believed about the invasion, about ports, and about American capabilities. These beliefs had been carefully constructed over years of military planning, intelligence analysis, and, most critically, ideological assumptions about industrial warfare. September 12, 1943. Wehrmacht High Command Conference Room, Berlin. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in Western Europe, presented his defensive strategy to senior staff officers. A large map of the French coast dominated one wall, marked with red pins indicating fortified positions. Von Rundstedt's pointer traced along the coastline. The Allies face an insurmountable problem, he explained. They cannot invade without capturing a major port. They cannot capture a major port without suffering catastrophic casualties. We have fortified every significant harbor from Norway to Spain. The logic was impeccable by traditional military standards. Modern armies required massive quantities of supplies. Infantry divisions consumed approximately 40 metric tons of material daily. Armored divisions needed 3 times that amount. An invasion force of sufficient size to threaten German positions would require landing thousands of tons of supplies every single day. This could only be accomplished through established port facilities with cranes, docks, warehouses, and transportation infrastructure. Admiral Theodor Kranke, commander of German naval forces in the West, reinforced this analysis. Our intelligence indicates the Allies are assembling landing craft capable of delivering troops directly onto beaches, he noted. But landing craft cannot sustain an army. They can deliver perhaps 200 tons per day per beach. An invasion force requires 10,000 tons daily at minimum. They must capture a port within 72 hours, or their attack will collapse from lack of supplies. This assessment was not mere speculation. It was supported by historical precedent, by detailed logistical calculations, and most significantly, by the disastrous Allied raid on Dieppe in August 1942. The Dieppe operation had been specifically designed to test whether the Allies could capture a defended port. Over 6,000 troops, predominantly Canadian, had assaulted the harbor. Within 9 hours, more than 3,600 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans had repulsed the attack without even deploying major reinforcements. The lesson seemed clear. Fortified ports were impregnable. General d'Artillerie Erich Marx, commanding the 84th Corps responsible for defending Normandy, built his entire defensive strategy around this assumption. His detailed analysis, submitted in October 1943, identified the most likely invasion beaches and then systematically dismissed them. 2,000. The Allies cannot sustain operations at Caen without capturing the port facilities, he wrote. The nearest significant port is Cherbourg, 50 kilometers from the proposed landing zones. They cannot supply an army across open beaches for the weeks required to capture Cherbourg. Therefore, they will attempt a direct assault on Cherbourg itself, or they will land at Calais where port facilities are closer. This analysis contained a fatal flaw, but it was a flaw that wouldn't become apparent until June 6, 1944. German planners assumed that logistics were constrained by existing infrastructure. They could not conceive that the Allies might bring their own infrastructure with them. The German blind spot wasn't due to lack of intelligence. Throughout 1943 and early 1944, German reconnaissance had detected unusual construction activity in British ports. Aerial photographs showed large concrete structures being built in dry docks along the Thames and Clyde rivers. Intelligence reports noted the construction of unusual steel pontoons and bridge sections. German analysts examined these photos carefully. Their conclusion, filed in March 1944, seemed reasonable. The concrete structures appear to be components for post-war reconstruction, possibly floating fuel storage tanks or temporary bridge supports. No evidence suggests the British are attempting anything beyond conventional port facilities. This interpretation was reinforced by German assumptions about engineering capabilities. Oberst Friedrich Hossbach, chief engineer for Army Group B, submitted a technical assessment in April 1944. To create a functional harbor requires stable breakwaters extending to depths of at least 10 meters, he wrote. Such structures cannot be transported and must be constructed on site. The construction time for adequate harbor facilities is measured in months, not days. The Allies may attempt temporary pier structures using their landing craft, but these will be vulnerable to weather and German artillery fire. They cannot provide sustainable logistics. What Hossbach didn't know was that British engineers had already solved every problem he considered insurmountable. At that very moment, 213 massive concrete caissons were nearing completion in British shipyards. Each of the largest caissons measured 61 meters long, 18 meters wide, and 18 meters tall, displacing over 6,000 tons. These Phoenix caissons could float when their internal chambers were filled with air, then sink in precise positions when water flooded those chambers. When arranged in careful arcs, they would form breakwaters 8 kilometers long, creating protected harbors in open water. Behind the Phoenix breakwaters would come the Spud pier heads, floating platforms mounted on massive legs that extended to the seabed. These pier heads could rise and fall with Normandy's 7-meter tides, maintaining stable platforms for ships to unload regardless of tidal conditions. Connecting the pier heads to shore would be the whale roadways, floating bridge spans supported by steel and concrete pontoons, creating highways on the water. The entire system represented something unprecedented in military history: portable, prefabricated infrastructure on a scale that defied conventional engineering assumptions. But more than that, it represented a fundamentally different approach to military logistics. The Germans planned to fight with what they had, conserving resources and defending fixed positions. The Americans and British planned to bring everything they needed, overwhelming any defense through sheer scale of supply. December 15, 1943. SS Panzer Division Headquarters, Nancy, France. SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt addressed his battalion commanders about the coming invasion. Witt was a veteran of campaigns in Poland, France, and Russia. His division was among the Wehrmacht's elite units, equipped with new Panther tanks and thoroughly trained. When the Allies come, Witt told his officers, their first objective will be capturing a port. They will land at Calais or attempt Cherbourg directly. Our mobile reserves will counterattack before they can establish supply lines. Without port facilities, their invasion force will wither within a week. Major Hubert Meyer, the division's operations officer, had reviewed intelligence reports about Allied preparations. The reconnaissance shows extensive landing craft construction, he noted. They may attempt beach landings at multiple points. Witt dismissed this concern. Landing craft can deliver troops, he said, but modern mechanized warfare requires fuel, ammunition, spare parts, heavy equipment. You cannot sustain armored divisions through small boats running onto beaches. They need cranes to unload tanks, warehouses to store ammunition, fuel depots to supply vehicles. All of this requires established ports. We have ensured they cannot capture ports without unacceptable losses. This confidence wasn't mere optimism. It was based on detailed understanding of logistical requirements. A single American armored division required 400 tons of supplies daily during active operations. An infantry division needed 300 tons. The Allied invasion force would need to include at least 8 divisions to have any hope of breaking through German defenses. This meant supplying over 3,000 tons per day, minimum, with requirements rapidly increasing as more divisions landed. The mathematics were inescapable. Landing craft of the type the Allies were building could carry perhaps 20 tons of cargo each. Even with constant operations, they could deliver only a few hundred tons per day per beach. To supply an invasion force adequately would require capturing port facilities capable of handling thousands of tons daily. The Germans had spent 3 years ensuring that capturing such ports would be impossible. What German planners failed to consider was that their entire analytical framework might be obsolete. They were fighting the last war, assuming that logistical constraints of 1918 or even 1940 still applied. They did not grasp that American industrial capacity had fundamentally changed the equation. February 28, 1944. Advanced Planning Meeting, Army Group B Headquarters, La Roche-Guyon. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recently appointed to command Army Group B, reviewed defensive preparations with his staff. Rommel had fought the Allies in North Africa and understood their capabilities better than most German officers. But even Rommel's assessment contained critical blind spots. The Allies have advantages in air power and naval gunfire, Rommel acknowledged, but they face fundamental limitations in logistics. I saw this in Africa. American units are dependent on massive supply chains. When those chains are disrupted, their operations collapse. In France, we can disrupt their logistics by denying them ports. If we can hold our coastal positions for even 2 weeks, their invasion will fail from lack of supplies. Rommel's chief of staff, General Lieutenant Hans Speidel, raised a concern. Intelligence suggests the British are constructing unusual structures that might be intended for harbour facilities. Rommel studied the reconnaissance photographs. The images showed large concrete boxes, floating pontoons, and steel bridge sections. These appear to be components for temporary piers, Rommel concluded. The British may attempt to extend their landing beaches with makeshift structures. But nothing in these photographs suggests they can create a functional port capable of handling the tonnage modern warfare requires. We should certainly target these structures with artillery when they appear, but they do not change our fundamental defensive strategy. This analysis, like so many others, was technically accurate but strategically wrong. Yes, the Mulberry harbours would be vulnerable to artillery fire. Yes, they were less efficient than established ports. But Rommel failed to consider that the Allies didn't need perfect logistics. They needed adequate logistics, sustained over time, supported by overwhelming industrial production. The Mulberry harbours would provide exactly that. April 9, 1944. Afternoon tea at the headquarters of the 716th Infantry Division, Cayenne. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, whose division defended the beaches that would become Gold and Juno sectors, discussed invasion scenarios with his regimental commanders. Richter was not a Nazi ideologue, but a professional soldier who had commanded troops since 1917. His assessment was sober and realistic, shaped by 3 decades of military experience. "The Allies will come," Richter told his subordinates. "Probably this summer. They have assembled forces in England that cannot be hidden, but they face the port problem. Every military operation requires a functioning logistics system. Landing troops is the easy part. Sustaining them is where invasions succeed or fail." He pulled out a map of Normandy. "The nearest significant port to our sector is Cherbourg. It would take the Allies at least 3 weeks to fight their way there, probably longer. During those 3 weeks, they must supply their forces across open beaches. This is impossible at the scale they require." Oberst Franz Korfis, commander of the 726th Infantry Regiment, asked, "What if they bring prefabricated port facilities?" Richter considered this. Temporary structures might allow them to land additional troops and light equipment, he conceded. But modern armor requires heavy cranes. Artillery needs ammunition ships with specialized unloading equipment. They cannot improvise a real port on an open beach. The engineering challenges alone would take months. This was the core of German confidence. Not that the Allies lacked courage or capability, but that they faced insurmountable engineering and logistical obstacles. German officers, trained in meticulous planning and careful resource management, could not imagine the Allies might simply overwhelm these obstacles through industrial scale and audacious engineering. May 20th, 1944. Final invasion preparations were underway in England. More than 45,000 workers at 300 sites across Britain were completing the components of the Mulberry harbours. The scale of the operation was staggering. Over 1 million cubic meters of concrete had been poured into the Phoenix caissons, 70,000 tons of steel. Reinforcement had been fabricated. 9,000 standards of timber had been shaped into formwork. The project had required more materials than some entire military campaigns. Yet German intelligence, despite observing much of this construction, never grasped its purpose or scale. They saw trees, but missed the forest. Individual components seemed innocuous or were misinterpreted. The vast coordination required to synchronize production across hundreds of sites went undetected. The Germans remained confident that their defensive strategy was sound. This confidence would last exactly 4 days after the invasion began. Then, German officers standing on the Norman cliffs would see something that shattered their understanding of modern warfare. They would see a port that shouldn't exist. They would see American industrial might made visible. And many would reach the same conclusion as General Lieutenant Richter. The war was already lost. June 6, 1944, 0200 hours. The English Channel. Convoy EBC-1, the first group of Mulberry Harbour components, departed British ports under cover of darkness. 132 tugboats strained against their tow lines, pulling the massive concrete Phoenix caissons at a painfully slow 8 kilometers per hour. The caissons rode low in the water, their internal chambers filled with just enough air to maintain buoyancy. Each tug crew knew their cargo was essential to the invasion, though many still didn't understand exactly what they were towing. Lieutenant Commander James Arnold, commanding the tug HMS Engage, later described the scene. "We could see the invasion fleet ahead of us, thousands of ships stretching to the horizon. Behind us came these enormous concrete boxes, each the size of a small apartment building. We knew they were meant to help supply the invasion, but the full picture didn't become clear until we reached Normandy. At 0630 hours, as the first Allied troops hit the beaches, the Mulberry convoy was still 12 hours from the French coast. The timing was deliberate. The beach assault had to succeed before the harbor components could be positioned. If the Germans repulsed the invasion, the Mulberry components would be worthless, stranded in mid-channel. By 1800 hours on June 6th, Allied forces had secured precarious footholds on 5 beaches. The landings at Omaha had nearly failed, with American troops pinned against the seawall for hours. But by evening, all 5 beaches were held, and the critical work could begin. June 7th, 0800 hours, off Arromanches. The first block ships approached Gold Beach. These were obsolete merchant vessels and warships, deliberately sacrificed to create initial breakwaters. HMS Centurion, a battleship dating from 1911, sailed to her final position. Her crew, reduced to a skeleton complement, opened the seacocks at precisely 0915. Within 20 minutes, Centurion settled onto the seabed, her superstructure still protruding above water. Over the next 48 hours, 70 more block ships would be scuttled in careful arcs off both Omaha and Arromanches, creating the Gooseberry breakwaters. From his position 3 kilometers inland, Oberst Corfez of the 726th Regiment observed the block ships through artillery spotting scopes. His report to division headquarters noted enemy vessels deliberately sunk in apparent pattern, possibly to create obstacles or sheltered anchorage for landing craft. The report was accurate, but didn't grasp the scale of what was coming. June 8th, 0600 hours. The first Phoenix caisson approached Arromanches. Lieutenant Alan Beckett of the Royal Engineers, who had designed much of the Mulberry system, supervised the positioning from a small motor launch. The massive caisson, designated Phoenix A1, was maneuvered into precise position using bearings taken from landmarks on shore. When the positioning was perfect, Beckett gave the order. Engineers opened valves in sequence, flooding specific chambers. The caisson settled majestically into the water, its base coming to rest on the seabed 23 feet below. It was extraordinary, Beckett later recalled. This structure, weighing over 6,000 tons, simply sank into place exactly where we needed it. We had tested the concept on models, but seeing it work at full scale was different. Everything depended on those caissons forming a solid breakwater. Over the following week, the Phoenix laying operation continued around the clock. Each caisson had to be positioned with precision, forming an arc that would create calm water inside while withstanding the full force of Atlantic waves outside. By June 15th, 115 Phoenix caissons had been sunk, creating a breakwater 8 kilometers long. German observation posts tracked this activity with growing confusion. Major Klaus Hoffmann, operations officer of the 716th Division, compiled reports from various units. Enemy constructing large concrete structures in water off Arromanches. Purpose unclear. Structures appear to form continuous barrier, approximately 7 kilometers in length. Artillery fire has damaged several structures, but does not prevent construction. Enemy dedicates significant resources to this project, suggesting major importance. On June 10th, General Lieutenant Richter personally observed the construction from the cliffs. What he saw defied his understanding of military engineering. The concrete structures were clearly designed to create a breakwater, but breakwaters required years to build, not days. Yet here, in less than a week, the British had created a barrier longer than most natural harbors. More disturbing were the other components arriving. Large floating platforms, which Richter's engineers correctly identified as pierheads, were being positioned inside the breakwater. These platforms, mounted on massive legs, could apparently rise and fall with the tide. British ships were already tying up alongside them. Most incredibly, Floating roadways were being extended from the pierheads toward the beach. Trucks were driving along these roadways, carrying supplies from ships directly to shore. Richter ordered his artillery to target the harbor structures. German 105mm guns fired on the Phoenix caissons. Several rounds struck home, chipping concrete and occasionally penetrating chambers. But the caissons were massive enough to absorb this damage. Even heavily damaged caissons remained functional as breakwaters. The floating roadways proved more vulnerable. German shells destroyed several whale spans, but British engineers simply replaced them with new sections towed from England. June 12, 1400 hours, Army Group B Headquarters, La Roche-Guyon. Field Marshal Rommel received the first comprehensive report on the Mulberry harbors. His intelligence staff had compiled observations from multiple units, aerial reconnaissance photographs, and interrogations of captured British engineers. The report's conclusion was stark. The British have constructed a functional artificial harbor at Arromanches, approximately 2 square miles in area, capable of handling significant cargo tonnage. Similar construction is underway at the American beach. The harbors appear to provide capabilities comparable to small natural ports. Rommel studied the reconnaissance photographs in silence. He had fought the British in North Africa and knew they were capable engineers, but this exceeded anything he had imagined possible. The photographs clearly showed cargo ships unloading at floating piers. Trucks moved along floating roadways. The harbor was functioning. He called in General Lieutenant Alfred Gauss, his chief of staff. "How long did we estimate it would take the Allies to capture Cherbourg?" Rommel asked. "Minimum 3 weeks, Herr Feldmarschall," Gauss replied. "Possibly 6 if we conduct a proper defense." Rommel tapped the photographs. "They don't need Cherbourg now. They've built their own port." He paused, then added, "I saw American logistics in Africa. If they can sustain supply through these harbors, our defensive strategy is obsolete." This was the moment when German High Command began to understand the true nature of their situation. The invasion wasn't just about landing troops on beaches. It was about sustaining an entire army indefinitely, using infrastructure the Allies had brought with them. Every German defensive plan had assumed logistical limitations would constrain Allied operations. Those limitations no longer existed. June 13th, 2300 hours. Officers meeting. 1st SS Panzer Corps. SS Obergruppenführer Josef Dietrich, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Corps, discussed the strategic situation with his division commanders. Dietrich was a crude but effective commander, one of Hitler's earliest supporters. But even he could recognize when battlefield realities contradicted ideological assumptions. "The British harbor at Arromanches is operational," Dietrich announced. "Intelligence reports it is handling over 2,000 tons of supplies daily, and that number is increasing. The American harbor at Omaha is similarly active." SS Brigadeführer Fritz Witt, commanding the 12th SS Panzer Division, asked the obvious question. "How is this possible? Building a port requires months." Dietrich's chief of staff, Brigadeführer Fritz Kramer, explained what intelligence had learned. They didn't build it in France. They built it in England, in pieces, and towed it across the channel. The concrete structures we've been observing are hollow boxes that float. Once positioned, they flood them to sink them in place. The floating piers use hydraulic systems to adjust for the tide. It's quite ingenious, actually. The room fell silent. These were experienced officers who understood logistics and engineering. They recognized immediately what the Mulberry harbors meant. SS Standartenführer Kurt Meyer, commanding the 25th SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, voiced what everyone was thinking. "If they can supply their forces without capturing ports, we cannot cut their logistics. Our entire defensive strategy assumed we could starve them out." Dietrich nodded grimly. "We can still defeat them tactically. Our panzers are superior, our defensive positions are strong. But strategically, they can sustain operations indefinitely. This changes everything." June 19th, 0300 hours. The English Channel. A violent storm swept across the water, the worst weather in over 20 years. Winds reached near hurricane strength. Waves over 7 meters high battered the Normandy coast. Inside the Mulberry harbors, chaos ensued. The bombardon floating breakwaters, positioned outside the main Phoenix caisson line, began to fail. These massive cruciform structures, made of steel and rubberized canvas, had been designed to absorb wave energy. but the storm exceeded their design specifications. Some bombardons broke apart under the pounding. Others parted their anchor chains and drifted into the harbors, becoming battering rams that smashed into the very structures they were supposed to protect. At Mulberry A, the American harbor off Omaha Beach, the damage was catastrophic. The bombardons destroyed several whale roadway sections. Waves lifted Phoenix caissons that hadn't been properly secured, shifting them out of position. 2 block ships literally broke their backs, their welded seams splitting under the strain. Landing craft were thrown onto the beaches or smashed against the pier heads. The storm raged for 3 days. All supply operations ceased. Ships at anchor struggled to maintain position. On the beaches, supplies stacked up with nowhere to go, creating logistical bottlenecks that would take weeks to clear. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. When the storm subsided on June 22nd, the damage assessment was sobering. Mulberry A was functionally destroyed. Only 10 out of 35 Phoenix caissons remained in proper position. The whale roadways were extensively damaged. General Dwight Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, made the difficult decision not to attempt reconstruction. The Americans would return to running landing craft directly onto Omaha Beach, though they would strengthen the remaining Gooseberry breakwater to provide some protection. Mulberry B at Arromanches had fared better. The more protected location and the fact that construction was further advanced made the critical difference. Approximately half the bombardons were lost, but the Phoenix caissons had held their positions. The decision was made to repair and significantly strengthen Port Winston, as the British had nicknamed their harbor. Additional Phoenix caissons were towed from England. Some were filled with sand to increase stability, a modification that proved so effective it was implemented for all remaining caissons. Steel plates were welded to the tops of damaged Phoenix units. The bombardon system was abandoned entirely, with future wave protection depending solely on the Phoenix caissons, Gooseberry block ships, and natural protection from the Calvados Reef. German commanders watched the storm damage with satisfaction tempered by realism. Oberst Walter Goth, artillery commander of the 84th Corps, reported to General Marks, "The storm has severely damaged enemy harbor facilities. However, the British are already conducting repairs. Their ability to bring replacement components from England means storm damage is merely a temporary setback." Marks understood the implication. Even nature couldn't stop Allied logistics. If a 3-day hurricane couldn't permanently disable the Mulberry harbors, German artillery certainly wouldn't. By June 28th, the rebuilt Mulberry B had returned to full operation. The harbor that German officers had watched with disbelief 2 weeks earlier was now handling 7,500 tons of cargo daily, achieving the ambitious design goals that had seemed impossible before the invasion. July 4th, 1944. Afternoon briefing, 7th Army Headquarters, Le Mans. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding 7th Army, received updated intelligence on Allied supply operations. The numbers were staggering. In the first 4 weeks since D-Day, the Allies had landed over 600,000 troops, 95,000 vehicles, and 630,000 tons of supplies. Most significantly, they had sustained these landing rates despite losing one of the 2 Mulberry harbors. Dollmann's Chief of Staff, General Major Max Pemsel, presented a detailed analysis. The British harbor at Arromanches is now handling more cargo daily than many peacetime commercial ports. The Americans, despite losing their artificial harbor, have developed efficient beach landing procedures using the Gooseberry breakwater. Combined, they are landing approximately 20,000 tons per day. This exceeds our most pessimistic pre-invasion estimates. The implications were profound. German defensive planning had assumed that even if the Allies established beachheads, logistical constraints would limit their operational tempo. German counterattacks could exploit these limitations, striking before the Allies could build up overwhelming force. But with 20,000 tons landing daily, the Allies could sustain continuous operations indefinitely. Every day, their material advantage grew larger. Dollmann, a career officer who had commanded troops since the First World War, recognized a hopeless situation when he saw one. "We are fighting an enemy who can replace every loss, resupply every unit, and reinforce every position. Our strategy was to bleed them faster than they could resupply." but they are resupplying faster than we can inflict casualties." He paused, then added quietly, "We cannot win a war of attrition against an opponent with infinite supplies." July 17th, 1944. General Oberst Dolman was found dead, officially from a heart attack, though some accounts suggested suicide. Whether he died from natural causes or by his own hand, the stress of commanding a hopeless defense had clearly taken its toll. August 1st, 1944. Port Winston had been operational for 8 weeks, double its designed operational life of 90 days. Yet the harbour showed no signs of failing. British engineers had continuously reinforced and improved the structures. Additional Phoenix caissons had been added. The Whale roadways had been strengthened with extra pontoons. What had been designed as temporary infrastructure was proving remarkably durable. Oberleutnant Heinrich Prinz Hussein Wittgenstein, an engineer attached to 7th Army headquarters, submitted a technical assessment of the Mulberry harbours. His report was a remarkable piece of analysis, combining respect for Allied engineering with recognition of its strategic implications. "The British artificial harbour represents a revolutionary approach to military logistics," Wittgenstein wrote. Rather than adapting their invasion plans to existing infrastructure, they created new infrastructure adapted to their plans. The harbour's modular design allows for continuous repair and improvement. Components damaged by weather or enemy fire can be replaced without disrupting operations. The entire system demonstrates a level of industrial organization and engineering capability that exceeds anything in German military planning. Wittgenstein's conclusion was stark. The existence of this harbour means Allied forces in France are logistically invulnerable. They can sustain operations indefinitely without capturing major ports. Our defensive strategy, which relied on denying them port facilities, has been rendered obsolete. We are now fighting an opponent with secure supply lines, overwhelming material superiority, and the industrial capacity to replace any losses. From a purely logistical perspective, the campaign in France is already lost. This assessment reached Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, who had replaced Rommel after Rommel was wounded in an air attack on July 17th. Von Kluge filed the report without comment, but its conclusions were inescapable. German officers had believed they could defeat the invasion by controlling ports. The Allies had simply eliminated ports from the equation. August 15th, 1944, Paris. As Allied forces advanced across France, German intelligence compiled a comprehensive analysis of Mulberry Harbour operations. The statistics told a story of industrial capability that bordered on the incomprehensible from a German perspective. From June 6th through August 15th, Mulberry B had handled over 1.7 million troops, 340,000 vehicles, and 2.7 million tons of supplies. At peak capacity, the harbour was moving cargo equivalent to what the port of Hamburg, Germany's largest commercial harbour, handled in peacetime. And the British had built it in weeks, not decades. The intelligence report noted something even more significant. The Americans, despite losing Mulberry A, had developed such efficient beach landing procedures that they were actually landing more supplies per day than the British were through Port Winston. Using DUKW amphibious trucks, LST landing ships that could drive directly onto beaches, and improved cargo handling techniques, American forces were offloading over 10,000 tons daily across Omaha Beach. The conclusion was inescapable. The Mulberry harbours had proven the concept that modern armies could everspace, operate without traditional port infrastructure. Even the destruction of Mulberry A hadn't significantly hindered American operations. The Allies had demonstrated that with enough engineering creativity and industrial capacity, any beach could become a port. September 1st, 1944. As Allied forces liberated Paris and pushed toward the German border, General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter was captured near the Seine River. The officer who had predicted the war was over upon seeing the Mulberry harbours had survived 3 months of desperate fighting. His division, which had defended the Norman beaches on D-Day, no longer existed as a fighting force. During his interrogation, Richter was asked when he had realized the invasion would succeed. His answer was immediate. "June 10th, when I saw what you were building at Arromanches, I had fought in the First War. I understood logistics. I knew that if you could supply an army across open beaches, you could not be stopped. Everything after that was just delaying the inevitable." The interrogating officer, a British major, asked if Richter thought the German army could have stopped the invasion if the Mulberry harbors hadn't existed. Richter considered carefully before answering. Perhaps for a time. Without the artificial harbors, you would have been forced to capture Cherbourg immediately. We might have held Cherbourg for weeks, maybe months. But ultimately, no. You would have brought more landing craft, developed better beach procedures, or built your harbors more slowly. The fundamental problem was not the harbors themselves. It was what they represented. Industrial capacity we could not match, engineering creativity we had not anticipated, and a strategic vision we had failed to understand. November 19, 1944. Port Winston was officially decommissioned after operating for 10 months, more than 3 times its designed lifespan. In those 10 months, the harbor had handled 2.5 million troops, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies. These numbers represented the margin of victory in the campaign to liberate Western Europe. The final supply convoy departed Arromanches on November 18th. British engineers surveyed the Phoenix caissons one last time. These massive concrete structures, which had seemed so audacious in design, had proven remarkably durable. Several would remain in position for decades, eventually becoming permanent features of the Norman coast. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce White, chief engineer for the Mulberry Project, reflected on the achievement in his final report. We were told to build a port that could handle 7,500 tons daily, operate in all weather, and last 90 days. We built a port that handled over twice that tonnage, survived the worst storm in 20 years, and operated for 10 months. More importantly, we proved that engineers need not be constrained by conventional assumptions. When told we couldn't build a port on an open beach, we simply redefined what a port could be. December 1944. Interrogation Center, London. German generals captured during the Normandy campaign were systematically interviewed about their pre-invasion assessments and their reactions to Allied capabilities. The transcripts of these interrogations reveal a consistent pattern: shock at the scale of Allied logistics, respect for the engineering achievement of the Mulberry harbors, and recognition that German strategic planning had been based on obsolete assumptions. General-Lieutenant Dietrich von Choltitz, who had commanded forces in Normandy before being transferred to Paris, was asked about the Mulberry harbors. "We knew you were building something," he said. "Our reconnaissance photographed construction in British ports, but we assumed these were components for port reconstruction after we had destroyed the French harbors. It never occurred to us you would build complete harbors from scratch and tow them across the channel. The engineering audacity was beyond our imagination." The interrogator pressed, "Did seeing the artificial harbors change your assessment of German chances?" Von Choltitz was blunt. It confirmed what some of us already suspected. We were fighting an opponent who could simply ignore obstacles we considered absolute. You needed ports, so you built them. When we destroyed your roads, you built new ones. When we cut your supply lines, you created alternate routes. You had the industrial capacity to overwhelm any defense through sheer material superiority. The artificial harbors were merely the most visible symbol of this capacity. General der Panzertruppen Leogaire von Schweppenberg, whose Panzer Group West had been tasked with destroying the invasion, offered perhaps the most penetrating analysis. The Mulberry harbors represented a revolution in military thinking that we failed to anticipate. For centuries, armies had been constrained by existing infrastructure. Campaigns were planned around roads, bridges, ports, railways. The side that controlled infrastructure had a decisive advantage. But your artificial harbors demonstrated that modern industrial powers need not accept these constraints. If infrastructure doesn't exist, you can create it. This fundamentally changes warfare. Von Schweppenberg continued, "We built the Atlantic Wall assuming you would need to capture existing ports. You made ports irrelevant. We fortified every harbor from Norway to Spain. You invaded where we had no harbors. This is not merely clever tactics. It is a strategic paradigm shift. Wars will no longer be won by controlling existing infrastructure, but by creating new infrastructure faster than the enemy can destroy it." Germany was not prepared for this type of warfare. January 1945. As Allied forces prepared to cross the Rhine, the final statistics on Mulberry harbor operations were compiled. The numbers told a story of engineering triumph and logistical dominance. Total cargo handled at Mulberry B, 4 million tons. Total vehicles landed 500,000. Total troops processed 2.5 million. Peak daily cargo throughput 7,500 tons. Total operational days 166. Cost of construction approximately £40 million sterling, equivalent to roughly £6 billion in modern currency. But the statistics didn't capture the broader impact. The Mulberry Harbours had fundamentally altered the strategic equation in Western Europe. By eliminating the need to capture major ports in the invasion's opening phase, they had given Allied forces operational flexibility that German defences couldn't counter. Every German defensive plan had assumed predictable Allied objectives. The Mulberry Harbours made Allied objectives unpredictable. March 1945, British War Office, London. A comprehensive post-operation report on the Mulberry Harbours was prepared for future military planning. The report's conclusions would influence military logistics doctrine for decades. The Mulberry artificial harbours demonstrate that modern industrial powers can create infrastructure faster than conventional construction timelines would suggest possible. Prefabricated, modular components allow complex systems to be assembled rapidly in hostile environments. This principle applies beyond harbours to roads, bridges, airfields, and other infrastructure. Future military operations should assume that logistical constraints can be overcome through engineering creativity and industrial capacity, rather than accepting them as absolute limitations. The report noted one particularly significant lesson. The Mulberry Harbours succeeded not because of any single innovation, but through the integration of multiple innovations into a coherent system. The Phoenix caissons solved the breakwater problem. The Spud pier heads solved the tidal problem. The whale roadways solved the ship-to-shore problem. Each component was relatively simple in concept, but required exceptional attention to detail in execution. This demonstrates that complex engineering challenges are best approached through systematic problem decomposition rather than searching for single revolutionary solutions. April 1945. As the war in Europe entered its final weeks, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, reflected on German defensive failures. In conversations recorded by his aide, Speer discussed the Mulberry Harbours with surprising candor. "We spent 3 years and used 13 million cubic meters of concrete building the Atlantic Wall," Speer said. "We fortified every port. We placed artillery batteries to destroy any invasion fleet. We built obstacles to prevent beach landings. All of this was rendered irrelevant by an idea of simple genius. The invasion force brought their own harbours." A fortnight after the Normandy landings, the British had a fully functional port operating on a beach that had been empty 2 weeks earlier. All our fortifications, all our concrete, all our planning meant nothing. Speer continued, "The Mulberry Harbours revealed the fundamental flaw in German strategic thinking. We assumed that wars are won by controlling what exists. The Allies understood that wars are won by creating what doesn't exist. We fortified ports. They built new ones. We destroyed roads. They built new ones. We cut supply lines. They created new ones. Against an opponent with such industrial capacity and engineering creativity, defensive strategies based on controlling infrastructure are obsolete." May 8, 1945. VE Day. The war in Europe was over. German forces had been crushed between advancing Allied armies from west and east. The Wehrmacht, once considered the finest military force in the world, had been defeated not primarily through superior tactics or braver soldiers, but through overwhelming industrial and logistical superiority. The Mulberry Harbours had played a crucial role in this victory. While other factors were certainly important, air superiority, numerical advantage, and intelligence supremacy, the artificial harbours had solved the fundamental logistical challenge that had constrained every previous amphibious invasion. They had proven that modern engineering could overcome obstacles that military tradition considered insurmountable. Post-war analysis. In the years following the war, military historians and engineers studied the Mulberry Harbour project extensively. Their analyses revealed several key factors that had enabled success. Political will. Winston Churchill's personal involvement ensured the project received highest priority. When engineers said something was impossible, Churchill demanded they find a way to make it possible. Industrial coordination. Over 300 companies collaborated on construction, coordinating delivery of components with precision despite wartime chaos. Engineering creativity. Rather than trying to improve existing harbor technology, engineers fundamentally reimagined what a harbor could be. Scale of resources. Britain devoted enormous industrial capacity to the project, treating it as essential to invasion success rather than a secondary priority. Attention to detail. Every component was carefully designed, tested, and refined. Success depended on thousands of small decisions being made correctly. Perhaps most significantly, the Mulberry harbors demonstrated the importance of challenging fundamental assumptions. When told that invading without capturing a port was impossible, Allied planners responded by questioning whether ports were actually necessary. This willingness to challenge conventional wisdom, to reimagine entire systems rather than just tweaking existing approaches, was perhaps the most important factor in Allied victory. The legacy. The remains of Port Winston still stand at Arromanches today, over 80 years after they were built. The Phoenix caissons remain where they were sunk in June 1944, covered with marine growth, but still structurally sound. They serve as a permanent memorial to one of history's most audacious engineering achievements. But the legacy extends far beyond the physical remains. The Mulberry harbors influenced military and civilian engineering in ways that continue to resonate. Modern military logistics doctrine assumes that infrastructure can be created rapidly in hostile environments rather than accepting existing infrastructure as a constraint. Modular construction techniques for rapid deployment of infrastructure in disaster areas owe conceptual debts to the Mulberry system. Military pontoon bridges, offshore oil platforms, and temporary housing after natural disasters all reflect lessons learned from the Mulberry harbors. The principle that seemingly impossible problems can be solved by refusing to accept that they are impossible has become embedded in engineering education. When every conventional approach leads to failure, the solution is not to give up but to question the assumptions underlying conventional approaches. For German officers who witnessed the Mulberry harbors in June 1944, the psychological impact was profound and immediate. They had built their entire defensive strategy on assumptions about Allied logistical limitations. The artificial harbors shattered those assumptions in a matter of days. The war didn't end in June 1944, but for many German officers, that was when they knew it would end in defeat. General Lieutenant Wilhelm Richter, standing on the Norman cliffs on June 10th, watching trucks drive along floating roadways toward floating piers where ships unloaded at floating docks, had understood immediately. The Allies hadn't just solved a logistical problem, they had demonstrated a level of industrial capability and engineering audacity that Germany could not match. They had shown that American industrial might, which German propaganda had dismissed as exaggeration, was actually understated. The war was over. Germany just didn't know it yet. But it would learn, day by day, as millions of tons of supplies flowed across those floating harbors, as Allied armies advanced with never-ending stocks of ammunition and fuel. As every destroyed tank was replaced and every casualty reinforced, the Mulberry harbors hadn't won the war in a single dramatic moment. They had guaranteed that the war would be won, steadily and inexorably, through the mathematics of industrial logistics. In the end, the story of the Mulberry harbors is not just about engineering achievement, though that achievement was remarkable. It is about strategic vision, the understanding that victory comes not from fighting the enemy's war, but from changing the nature of war itself. The Germans had prepared to fight a war of attrition, believing their superior tactics and technology would overcome Allied numerical advantages. The Allies understood that in modern industrial warfare, the side with secure supply lines and overwhelming material superiority would ultimately prevail. The Phoenix caissons, Spud pierheads, and whale roadways were not merely engineering solutions. They were strategic weapons that neutralized Germany's carefully prepared defenses. They were proof that when political will, engineering creativity, industrial capacity, and human determination all align toward a common goal, achievements that seem impossible become inevitable. The German officers who watched the Mulberry harbors take shape understood this. They had been trained to believe that quality defeats quantity, that tactical excellence compensates for material disadvantage, that warrior spirit overcomes industrial might. The artificial harbors proved all these beliefs were obsolete. Modern war had become industrial, and the side with the greatest industrial capacity, the most efficient logistics, and the willingness to think beyond conventional constraints would win. General Lieutenant Richter had been right. The war was over. The Mulberry Harbors had made it so, not through direct destruction of German forces, but through the creation of an unbreakable Allied supply chain. Everything that followed, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of France, the crossing of the Rhine, the final assault on Germany, all of it was made possible by those floating harbors that shouldn't have existed but did. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.